Sometimes the hardest journey is the one that leads us home. After 30 years of battles and bloodshed, Astrid thought she knew who she was, a warrior with no roots, no family, no reason to look back. But when her uncle died and left her his old longhouse in the Norwegian mountains, she found herself returning to the place she'd run from as a young woman. The house looked abandoned, with its moss-covered roof and that strange twin skull carving above the door. She expected to find nothing but rot and bad memories. Instead, she discovered a hidden thermal pool beneath the floorboards, filled with ancient gold coins that had been waiting centuries to be found. The treasure was real, but as Astrid dug deeper into her family's past, she realized the gold was the least important thing she'd inherited. What happens when a woman who spent her life destroying things finally learns she has something worth building? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain road to Hjørleif had not improved in 3 decades. Astrid's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel as her rental car lurched through another pothole, the engine straining against the steep grade. Pine trees pressed close on either side, their branches heavy with morning mist that seemed to whisper secrets she had spent most of her life trying to forget. She had received the letter from the Norwegian solicitor 2 months ago, delivered to her small apartment in Copenhagen, where she had been recovering from her last campaign. The envelope bore her uncle's name, Magnus Eriksdotter, written in careful script that seemed to carry the weight of mountain stone. Inside, formal language had conveyed what her heart already knew. The last connection to her childhood was gone, and with his passing, the longhouse that had haunted her dreams now belonged to her. 30 years. 30 years since she had fled this place at 17. Her grandmother's silver arm ring, the only thing she had taken besides the clothes on her back, and a burning need to prove herself in a world that measured worth by the sharpness of one's blade. She had succeeded beyond her wildest imagination, earning her place among the most respected warriors in the reenactment communities across Europe, leading historical expeditions and fighting in tournaments that had made her name known from Dublin to Prague. But success in battle, she had learned, was a cold companion in the quiet hours. The village of Hjørleif appeared around a bend, like something from a half-remembered dream. Wooden houses with turf roofs clung to the mountainside, their windows glowing warm yellow against the grey morning. Smoke curled from chimneys, carrying the scent of burning birch that immediately transported her back to childhood mornings when her grandmother would wake before dawn to tend the fire. Astrid parked outside Anderson's general store, the same building where she had once bought penny sweets with coins earned by helping her uncle split firewood. The old metal signs still hung askew, paint peeling but readable. Through the window, she could see shelves lined with the same practical goods that mountain folk had always needed: rope, batteries, preserved foods, thick woolen socks. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, its sound unchanged. Behind the counter stood a woman, perhaps her own age, with prematurely grey hair braided in the old style. She looked up from her ledger, and recognition flickered across her weathered features. "Astrid Eriksdotter," the woman said, her voice carrying the musical lilt of the old dialect. "We heard you would be coming." "Greta Anderson," Astrid replied, memories flooding back. "You still remember me? Some things do not change easily in these mountains." Greta's eyes held a mixture of warmth and something else perhaps, wariness. "Though I hear you have made quite a name for yourself in the wider world." Astrid shifted uncomfortably under the familiar weight of small-town knowledge. "Magnus's funeral, when was it held?" 3 weeks past. "The weather was too poor for you to travel then, I think." Greta's tone held no judgment, but Astrid felt the absence of her presence like a physical weight. "He spoke of you often in his later years, always wondered if you would return. I'm here now." The words came out harder than she intended. Greta nodded slowly. "The longhouse has been empty since his passing. Old Ericsson has the keys. He lives in the blue house near the bridge. Magnus left instructions that you were to have them whenever you arrived. Astrid purchased supplies for several days: coffee, bread, canned goods, batteries for the flashlight she had brought. As Greta rang up her items, the older woman's hands paused over a bundle of dried herbs. "Your grandmother always said the mountain holds memories," Greta said quietly. "Some are meant to stay buried, others fight to be found." Before Astrid could ask what she meant, the bell chimed again as another customer entered. The conversation was over, but the words lingered like mist as Astrid drove the final kilometre to her uncle's home. The longhouse sat in a clearing carved from the mountainside, just as she remembered. Time had softened its edges, moss crept across the turf roof, and the wooden walls had weathered to a silver grey that blended with the surrounding stones. But the structure remained solid, built in the old way with thick timber posts and careful joinings that could outlast generations. Above the heavy oak door, the twin skull carving still leered down at visitors. As a child, she had been terrified of those hollow eye sockets and bared teeth. Her grandmother had called it a protection symbol, meant to frighten away evil spirits. Her uncle had simply called it tradition. Now, studying it with an esteem, adult's eyes, Astrid could see the craftsmanship in the detailed work. This was not some crude talisman, but the work of a master carver who understood both art and meaning. Ericsson was waiting for her on the wooden steps, a small man bent with age, but still spry in his movements. His eyes were the pale blue of winter sky, sharp with intelligence despite his years. "You have your grandmother's walk," he said by way of greeting, offering her a set of iron keys that looked as old as the building itself. "Proud, like you are not asking the mountain for permission to be here." "I take it that's not necessarily a compliment," Astrid replied, accepting the keys. "Depends on what the mountain decides to show you." Ericsson's smile was enigmatic. Magnus was much the same way when he was young. It took him many years to learn to listen properly. The old man departed without further explanation, leaving Astrid alone before the door of her inheritance. The largest key turned easily in the lock, as if the house had been waiting for her return. Inside, the air was cool and dry, carrying the scent of old wood and something else, something that reminded her of deep earth and growing things. Magnus had been a meticulous caretaker. Dust covers protected the furniture, and everything was arranged with the precision of a man who valued order. But underneath the preservation, Astrid could sense the bones of the home she remembered. The main room stretched before her, dominated by a stone hearth large enough to roast a sheep. Her grandmother's chair still sat beside it, its carved arms worn smooth by decades of use. The kitchen area occupied one corner, equipped with both modern conveniences and the old wood-burning stove that had served the family for generations. Astrid moved through the space like a ghost, returning to haunt familiar ground. Here was the cabinet where her grandmother had kept her collection of unusual stones. There was the window seat, where she had spent rainy afternoons learning to braid ropes and mend nets. In the corner, a narrow staircase led to the sleeping loft, where she had dreamed of adventures in distant lands. But it was Magnus's study that drew her attention. The small room off the main hall was lined floor to ceiling with books, most bound in leather and written in languages she could barely remember reading. Maps hung on the walls not just of Norway, but of places she had never heard of, marked with symbols that seemed to pulse with meaning just beyond her understanding. On the desk sat a leather-bound journal, thick with years of entries. The cover was worn smooth, and when she opened it, Magnus's careful handwriting filled every page. The entries were dated going back decades, written in the old Norwegian that her grandmother had insisted she learn alongside the modern tongue. Year of our Lord 1995. Read one entry near the beginning. The signs grow stronger, the protection holds, but I sense movement in the deep places. The ravens speak of unrest among the old powers. I pray Astrid's path leads her far from these burdens, but the blood calls to blood, and choice is often an illusion when dealing with matters this ancient. Astrid's hands trembled as she read. Magnus had been writing about her, tracking her life from a distance while wrestling with concerns she could not begin to understand. Entry after entry spoke of the guardianship, the old obligations, and the price of breaking faith with the deep ones. The journal painted a picture of her uncle as far more than the simple, mountain hermit she had imagined. These pages revealed a man burdened by knowledge, struggling with responsibilities that seemed to stretch back generations. References to her grandmother appeared frequently, always with reverence for her wisdom and power. Helga would know how to interpret the omens. Read one passage, she could speak to the ravens in their own tongue, could see the threads that bind past to future. I am but a caretaker compared to her understanding. As afternoon faded toward evening, Astrid found herself drawn to investigate the sounds she kept hearing. Beneath her feet, a subtle bubbling, like water moving over stone. Following the sound led her to examine the floorboards near the back of the main room. Some of the planks seemed newer than others, and when she knelt to examine them more closely, she found they were not nailed down but rather fitted with careful precision. Lifting the boards revealed a sight that stopped her breath entirely. Below the floor, carved directly into the living rock of the mountain, was a natural thermal pool, perhaps 3 meters across. Steam rose from water so clear it seemed like liquid crystal, and the bottom was lined with stones that glowed with their own inner light. But it was what lay scattered across those glowing stones that made her heart race. Gold coins caught the fading light from above, hundreds of them resting on the pool's bottom like fallen stars. Some were clearly ancient Roman, Byzantine, Arabic script she could not read. Others bore the marks of medieval kingdoms, their faces worn smooth by time and water. The treasure was real, more real than anything in the stories her grandmother had told. But as Astrid stared into the depths, she began to notice other things among the coins. Carved stones bore runic inscriptions that seemed to shift and writhe in the reflected light. Metal objects that were not quite coins gleamed with designs that hurt to look at directly. And at the very center of the pool, half hidden by the distortion of the water, something large and dark rested against the bottom stones. The light was failing, and she lacked the proper equipment to explore further. But as she carefully replaced the floorboards, Astrid's mind raced with questions that had no easy answers. This was not simply a hidden treasure, this was something far older, far more complex than mere wealth. Magnus's journal had spoken of guardianship and ancient obligations. Looking around the longhouse with new eyes, Astrid began to see signs she had missed before. Protective symbols carved into door frames. Iron nails driven in patterns that were definitely not random, bundles of herbs hanging in specific arrangements that her grandmother would have recognized immediately. Her uncle had not been simply living here, he had been protecting something. And now, whether she wanted it or not, that protection had become her responsibility. As darkness settled over the mountains, Astrid built a fire in the great hearth and settled into her grandmother's chair with Magnus's journal. Outside, she could hear the wind picking up, carrying with it sounds that might have been natural or might have been something else entirely, testing the boundaries of whatever ancient agreements her family had spent generations maintaining. The gold was beautiful, certainly valuable enough to change her life in material ways. But sitting in the chair where her grandmother had taught her the old stories, reading her uncle's careful record of a lifetime spent in service to mysteries she barely understood, Astrid began to suspect that the true treasure and the true burden of her inheritance lay not in wealth, but in knowledge that came with a price she was only beginning to comprehend. Morning brought clarity that the previous evening's discoveries had lacked. Astrid woke in the sleeping loft where she had spent her childhood, sunlight streaming through windows that looked out over the fjord far below. The familiar view steadied her. Whatever strange inheritance awaited her investigation, this was still the landscape that had shaped her earliest memories. She descended to the main room with purpose, carrying the diving equipment she had purchased in Bergen during her journey north. Years of underwater archaeology training would serve her well today. The thermal pool had revealed only glimpses of its secrets in yesterday's fading light, but proper exploration required preparation and respect for the dangerous beauty of heated mountain springs. The floorboards came up easily once she understood their mechanism. Magnus had designed them to be removed by someone who knew the secret, but to appear permanently fixed to casual observation. Steam rose from the water as she knelt beside the pool's edge, testing the temperature with her hand. Warm, but not scalding. The heat came from deep thermal vents, she realized, fed by the same geothermal forces that powered Iceland's famous springs. Slipping into the crystal-clear water, Astrid felt the temperature embrace her like a living thing. The bottom was perhaps 2 meters down, easily within her diving capabilities, and the water was so pure she could see every detail with perfect clarity. The gold coins scattered across the bottom were even more numerous than she had initially observed, hundreds, perhaps thousands, representing centuries of accumulated wealth. But it was the other objects that drew her attention as she descended. Carved stones bore inscriptions in runic alphabets she recognized from her historical studies, though the meanings remained elusive. Strange metal discs that were definitely not coins gleamed with designs that seemed to incorporate astronomical symbols alongside protective marks. And there, half buried beneath a drift of ancient gold, lay the object that would change everything. The runestone fragment was roughly the size of her palm, carved from black basalt and inscribed with runes that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Unlike the weathered stones above, these markings were sharp and clear, as if they had been carved yesterday rather than centuries ago. As her fingers closed around the fragment, Astrid felt a jolt of sensation that was definitely not merely the thermal water's warmth. Images flashed through her mind, brief, disjointed, but vivid as living in memory. A woman who looked remarkably like her grandmother standing at this very pool, speaking words in a language that predated written Norwegian, ravens circling overhead in numbers that darkened the sky, and something else, something vast and patient and definitely not human, listening from depths that extended far beyond the reach of normal sight. The vision lasted only seconds, but it left Astrid gasping as she surfaced, the runestone clutched in her trembling hand. The water around her seemed suddenly colder despite the thermal heating, and shadows that had no earthly source flickered at the edges of her vision. "You should not have touched that without proper preparation." The voice from above made her heart nearly stop. An elderly man stood at the edge of the pool, looking down at her with eyes that held both concern and something that might have been fear. She recognized him after a moment, Eriksson, the keeper of Magnus's keys, though how he had entered the locked longhouse without her hearing remained a mystery. "How did you get in here?" Astrid demanded, pulling herself from the water with as much dignity as she could manage while dripping wet and clutching a potentially priceless artifact. "I have been coming to this house for 60 years, Eriksson replied calmly. "Magnus was my cousin, though few in the village remember that connection now. I helped him maintain the protections when his strength began to fail." "Protections against what?" The runestone in her hand seemed to pulse with warmth that had nothing to do with the thermal spring. Eriksson's weathered face grew grave. "Against the consequences of breaking faith with those who placed this burden upon our bloodline. Magnus knew his time was growing short. He hoped you would never return, that the responsibility might pass to some distant cousin who could be trained gradually. But blood calls to blood, and the old powers do not wait for convenient timing." Astrid wrapped herself in a towel, still holding the carved stone. "You're talking about magic, ancient curses. These are things from children's stories." "Are they?" Eriksson gestured toward the runestone. "What did you see when you touched it?" The question struck her silent. The visions had been too vivid, too detailed to dismiss as imagination or the effect of warm water and strange circumstances. She had felt the presence of others in this place, witnessed rituals that belonged to an age when the boundary between the natural and supernatural was far thinner than modern minds preferred to believe. Your grandmother Helga was the last true Volva in these mountains, Ericsson continued. She could speak to the ravens, interpret the patterns in stone and flame, and most importantly, she understood the compact our people made with the guardians of the deep places. When she died, Magnus took up the burden as best he could, but he lacked her gifts. He was a caretaker, not a true guardian. And you think I'm supposed to be what, some kind of mystical protector? Astrid's voice carried the skepticism of 3 decades spent in the rational world beyond these mountains. I think you are Helga's granddaughter, trained in the arts of war, marked by the old blood, and currently holding a binding stone that has not seen daylight for 200 years. Ericsson's tone remained patient, but she could sense the urgency beneath his calm exterior. The question is not what I think you should be, but what you choose to do with what you have inherited. He moved to Magnus's desk and retrieved a slim volume bound in dark leather. Your uncle prepared this for whoever would come after him. It explains the history, the obligations, and the consequences of various choices. But first, you must understand what you have awakened by removing that stone from its resting place. The book felt heavy in her hands, weighted with more than mere paper and binding. The title, embossed in silver letters, read, The Guardian's Burden, a record of the Eriksdotter Compact. Opening to the first page revealed Magnus's careful handwriting in modern Norwegian, clearly intended for someone who might not be fluent in the ancient dialects. For 300 years, the introduction began, our family has served as guardians of a sacred trust. We are the wardens of a prison that holds something that must never be allowed to return to the world above. The gold in the thermal pool is not treasure in any conventional sense, it is payment offered by those who begged our ancestors to accept this burden when no other power on earth could contain what they had awakened through their hubris. Astrid looked up from the book to find Ericsson watching her intently. A prison? What kind of prison requires centuries of human guardians? The kind that holds something that exists as much in the realm of will and intention as in the physical world, he replied. Something that can influence minds, corrupt purposes, and turn guardian into servant if the proper protections are not maintained. The runestone you hold is one of 12 binding anchors. By removing it from the pool, you have weakened the containment by 1/12. A chill that had nothing to do with her wet clothing settled over Astrid. How long do I have before whatever this is realizes what's happened? It already knows. Ericsson's voice carried the weight of unpleasant certainty. The entity we guard is patient, but not passive. It has been testing the boundaries of its confinement for decades, seeking any weakness, any opportunity. Magnus's death created the first real opening it has had in generations. Your touching the binding stone has given it a direct connection to the current guardian. Then I put it back. The solution seemed obvious. I replace the stone, seal up the pool, and leave, find some distant cousin to inherit this mess. The entity you would release upon an untrained guardian would break free within days. Ericsson shook his head grimly, and you cannot simply put the stone back. By touching it, you have created a mystical connection that will persist until you either accept the full guardianship or what? Or it consumes you and uses your body as a vessel to escape its prison. The casual way he delivered this information made it somehow more terrifying than if he had shouted warnings. Astrid sank into her grandmother's chair, still gripping the runestone that now felt less like treasure and more like a trap. How long do I have to make this choice? The next new moon. 11 days. Ericsson consulted an old almanac from Magnus's shelf. The binding is weakest during the dark of the moon. If you have not accepted the guardianship by then, if you have not renewed the compact through the proper ritual, the entity will have accumulated enough influence to break free entirely. Astrid stared into the thermal pool, where the remaining gold coins caught the morning light like fallen stars. 11 days to decide between accepting a lifetime of mystical responsibility or facing some ancient evil that her family had kept imprisoned for 3 centuries. The woman who had built her life on clear choices and honest combat suddenly found herself in a situation where every option led into unknown territory. "What happened to the other guardians, who refused?" she asked quietly. Eriksson was silent for a long moment. "There is a reason why this burden has remained in your bloodline for so many generations," he finally said. "Choice, it seems, is often an illusion when dealing with powers this ancient." Outside, she could hear ravens calling to each other in patterns that sounded almost like conversation. The sound, which had been merely atmospheric yesterday, now carried undertones of meaning she was not quite ready to interpret. Something was awakening in these mountains. Something that had been waiting patiently for an opportunity that her return had finally provided. The runestone grew warm in her palm, and for just a moment she could swear she felt something vast and malevolent brush against the edges of her consciousness, testing the strength of will that had carried her through 30 years of warfare. The touch was gone almost instantly, but it left behind the absolute certainty that her fight was just beginning. And this time, the enemy was something no sword could reach. 3 days had passed since Eriksson's revelation, and Astrid found herself caught between the warrior's instinct to face challenges head-on, and the growing realization that this situation required knowledge she did not possess. Magnus's record of the Guardian's burden made for sobering reading, filled with references to rituals, protective ceremonies, and mystical concepts that belonged to a worldview she had abandoned decades ago. She had spent the morning searching through her uncle's carefully organized belongings, looking for anything that might help her understand the heritage Eriksson claimed was her birthright. It was in a cedar chest beneath Magnus's bed that she found the first tangible connection to her grandmother's memory, a silver arm ring that gleamed despite its obvious age, its surface decorated with intricate engravings of ravens in flight. The moment her fingers touched the metal, another wave of visions crashed over her consciousness. This time, the images were clearer, more focused. She saw her grandmother as a young woman, standing in the main room of this very longhouse. But the space looked different, older, more primitive, lit by oil lamps rather than electric fixtures. Helga wore the silver arm ring as she spoke in the ancient Norwegian dialect, her words carrying power that seemed to make the very air shimmer. Around her gathered ravens, not just a few birds, but dozens of them, perched on every available surface and listening with an intelligence that was definitely not natural. As Helga spoke, the ravens responded with calls that formed patterns, almost like a conversation in a language that predated human speech. The vision faded, leaving Astrid sitting on the floor beside Magnus's bed, the arm ring clutched in her trembling hand. But this time, the after-effects were different. Instead of the bone-deep chill that had followed her contact with the runestone, the arm ring left her feeling strangely connected to something larger than herself. "You're beginning to awaken." The voice came from the window, where a large raven perched on the sill, regarding her with eyes that held far too much intelligence for any ordinary bird. As she watched in fascination, the raven's beak opened and closed in perfect synchronization, with words that seemed to form directly in her mind, rather than reaching her through normal hearing. "This is not possible," Astrid whispered, though even as she spoke, she realized that the concept of impossibility had become meaningless over the past few days. "Many things become possible when the blood remembers what the mind has forgotten," the raven replied, ruffling its feathers with what might have been amusement. "Your grandmother could speak with all the ravens of these mountains. The gift skips generations sometimes, but it never truly dies." Astrid slipped the silver arm ring onto her wrist, where it fit as if it had been made specifically for her. The moment the metal settled against her skin, she could sense other ravens throughout the surrounding forest, dozens of them, all aware of her presence and waiting for something she did not yet understand. "What are you waiting for?" she asked the raven at the window. For you to remember who you are meant to be, it replied, or for the entity in the deep places to break free and make such remembering irrelevant. A knock at the front door interrupted this surreal conversation. The raven took flight immediately, disappearing into the forest with a call that sounded almost like laughter. Astrid rose, still feeling the warm weight of the arm ring on her wrist, and went to answer the door. The man standing on her threshold was perhaps 50 years old, with the lean build of someone who spent his life walking mountain trails. His dark hair was streaked with premature grey, and his eyes held the keen intelligence of a natural scholar. He wore practical hiking clothes and carried a leather satchel that bulged with books and papers. "Astrid Erik's daughter?" he asked, offering a slight bow that seemed to come from centuries of ingrained courtesy. "I am Bjorn Haugen. Magnus was—" He paused, his voice catching slightly. "Magnus was my friend. Eriksson told me you had returned. Please come in." Astrid stepped aside, recognizing something in his manner that spoke of shared grief and genuine concern. "You knew my uncle well? For nearly 20 years. Bjorn entered the longhouse, his eyes automatically checking the protective symbols carved into the doorframe, a gesture so natural it was clearly habitual. "I helped him research the historical context of your family's guardianship. Most of the village thinks I'm simply a historian who enjoys old stories, but the truth is somewhat more complex." He set his satchel on Magnus's desk and began withdrawing books and manuscripts that looked far older than anything she had seen in her uncle's collection. "These are some of the original records," he explained. "Chronicles that document how the compact was first made, what your ancestors agreed to guard, and most importantly, what happens when the guardianship fails." Astrid settled into her grandmother's chair, unconsciously stroking the silver arm ring on her wrist. "Eriksson says, I have 11 days to decide whether to accept this responsibility. But how can I make such a choice without understanding what I would be agreeing to?" "An excellent question." Bjorn opened one of the ancient texts, revealing pages covered in runic script and intricate diagrams. "The entity your family guards is not entirely physical. It exists primarily as a form of concentrated malevolence, what the old texts call a shadow of the first breaking. It was created during the early days of human civilization, when certain groups attempted to harness forces they could not possibly control." "Created how?" Astrid leaned forward, her warrior's mind automatically analyzing this threat in tactical terms. "Through sacrifice," Bjorn replied grimly. "Ritual murder on a scale that poisoned the very land where it was performed. The entity is the accumulated hatred and pain of thousands of innocent victims, given form and purpose by those who thought they could bind such power to their will." He turned the page to reveal a map that showed the northern regions of what was now Norway, marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly. It broke free from its original bindings in the 14th century and rampaged across these mountains for nearly a decade. Entire settlements vanished overnight. Survivors spoke of shadows that moved independently of their sources, of dreams that drove people to madness, of livestock found drained, not of blood, but of something far more essential. Astrid felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. How was it stopped? "It wasn't stopped," Bjorn corrected. "It was contained. Your ancestor, Ragnhild Eriksdotter, was a vulva of exceptional power. She led a group of warriors and other practitioners in a ritual that created a mystical prison beneath these mountains. The thermal pool is the visible manifestation of that binding, but the true prison extends deep into the earth, held in place by a network of runestones and the will of sworn guardians." "And the gold? Payment from the surviving settlements?" Bjorn explained. "Every community that had lost people to the entity contributed what they could afford to support the guardians. It was understood that this burden would require generations of dedication and that those who accepted it would need resources to maintain their vigilance." Astrid stood and walked to the hidden pool, lifting the floorboards to stare down at the treasure that suddenly seemed less like wealth and more like a memorial to ancient tragedy. "What happens if it escapes?" The historical records suggest that a free entity of this type grows stronger by feeding on human fear and suffering, Bjorn said quietly. In the modern world, with our dense populations and instant communication, the potential for exponential growth in its power is... He paused, searching for words. Difficult to calculate, but probably catastrophic. The silver arm ring grew warm on her wrist, and she found herself thinking of the raven's words about remembering who she was meant to be. 30 years of warrior training had taught her to recognize duty when she encountered it, but this responsibility was unlike any battlefield challenge she had ever faced. The ritual Eriksson mentioned, she said. What does it involve? Bjorn consulted another text, this one written in Magnus's careful handwriting. According to your uncle's notes, the Guardian must formally accept the compact during the dark of the moon, renewing the mystical bonds that maintain the prison. The ceremony requires specific components, water from the thermal pool, blood freely given, and most importantly, the conscious choice to bind oneself to this place and purpose. For how long? Until death, Bjorn replied simply. Or until you train a successor from your own bloodline. The magic is tied to the Eriksdotter line specifically. No one else can maintain the binding. Astrid felt the weight of centuries pressing down on her shoulders. Every generation of her family had faced this same choice, and every generation had chosen duty over freedom. But they had been raised to this knowledge, prepared from childhood for the possibility she was being asked to accept a mystical responsibility she barely understood, based on bloodline claims to power she wasn't even sure she possessed. There's something else, Bjorn said hesitantly. Magnus's final entries suggest that the entity has been growing stronger recently. Climate change, industrial pollution, the general stress of modern life. These things may be weakening the original bindings. He believed that the next Guardian would need to be more than just a caretaker. They would need to be someone capable of actively reinforcing the prison. Someone with warrior training, Astrid realized. Someone with the will to fight, even when the enemy cannot be reached with conventional weapons. Bjorn closed the ancient text carefully. Your grandmother's gifts, combined with your military experience, might be exactly what these circumstances require. Outside, she could hear ravens calling to each other in the complex patterns that were beginning to sound more like language and less like simple bird chatter. The silver arm ring pulsed gently against her skin, and she found herself thinking that perhaps some inheritances could not be refused, they could only be delayed until the consequences became unbearable. 8 days remained until the new moon, and Astrid was beginning to understand that the choice she faced was not really whether to accept the guardianship, but whether to embrace it willingly or have it forced upon her by circumstances beyond her control. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor. Astrid was reading through Magnus's notes on protective rituals when she heard the sound of an approaching vehicle unusual enough in this remote location to warrant investigation. Through the window, she watched a battered pickup truck navigate the rough mountain road, driven by a woman with steel-gray hair who moved with the confident efficiency of someone accustomed to mountain living. The woman who emerged from the truck was perhaps 60 years old, with the weathered hands of someone who had spent decades working with tools and the direct gaze of someone unaccustomed to deception. She wore practical clothes, wool sweater, heavy boots, canvas jacket, but carried herself with a dignity that spoke of inner strength, tested by time and circumstance. You must be Astrid, the woman said, approaching the longhouse with measured steps. I am Solveig Anderson. I was... She paused, her voice catching slightly. I was Magnus's companion for the last 15 years of his life. Astrid felt a jolt of surprise. Magnus had never mentioned a romantic relationship in any of his writings, and the village gossips had not shared this information during her brief interactions. Please, come in. I had no idea, my uncle. We kept our relationship private, Solveig explained as she entered the longhouse. Magnus felt that the guardianship was burden enough without subjecting someone he cared about to the scrutiny that came with it. But now that he's gone, and you've returned, There are things you need to know that he would never have written down. She moved through the space with the familiarity of someone who had spent considerable time here, automatically avoiding the floorboards that concealed the thermal pool and nodding respectfully toward the protective symbols carved into the walls. In the kitchen area, she began preparing coffee with the ease of long practice. "Magnus loved you very much," Solveig said as she worked. "He spoke of you constantly, followed your career through newspaper articles and tournament reports that Bjorn helped him find online. He was incredibly proud of what you had accomplished, but also terrified that your success would keep you far from these mountains when the time came for transition." Astrid settled at the kitchen table, studying this woman who had clearly meant more to her uncle than she had ever realized. Why didn't he reach out to me directly? Try to prepare me for this inheritance? Because he hoped, until the very end, that there might be another way. Solveig poured coffee into 2 heavy ceramic mugs, the kind that had been warming hands in this kitchen for generations. He spent 20 years researching alternatives, ways to transfer the guardianship to someone outside the bloodline, methods to permanently contain the entity without requiring human oversight, even the possibility of destroying it entirely. What did he discover? Solveig's expression grew grim. That the binding is more complex than any single guardian fully understands. The entity exists partially outside normal time and space. It has been influencing events for centuries, guiding circumstances to create the conditions for its eventual escape. Magnus came to believe that every guardian who had died of natural causes had actually been murdered by the entity working through human agents it had corrupted. The coffee suddenly tasted bitter in Astrid's mouth. "You're saying this thing can control people?" "Not control. Exactly. Influence. It feeds on negative emotions, fear, anger, despair, hatred. In large enough quantities, these emotions can create openings that allow it to whisper suggestions into susceptible minds." Solveig sat across from her, hands wrapped around her mug as if seeking warmth. Magnus documented several instances where previous guardians faced unexpected deaths at crucial moments, hunting accidents, sudden illnesses, even suicide in one case. Astrid thought of the malevolent presence she had sensed when touching the runestone, the feeling of something vast and patient testing her defenses. "How long have you known about all this?" "Magnus told me everything when our relationship became serious," Solveig replied. "I wanted to share the burden, to help him in whatever way I could. But the guardianship cannot be divided or delegated. All I could do was support him through the lonely hours when the responsibility felt overwhelming." She reached into her jacket and withdrew an object wrapped in dark cloth. "This is why I've come today. Magnus asked me to give this to whoever succeeded him, but only after they had begun to understand the true scope of their inheritance." Unwrapping the cloth revealed an iron dagger, perhaps 20 centimeters long, its blade etched with runic inscriptions that seemed to shift and flow in the morning light. The handle was carved from some dark wood and bound with wire that had been wound in complex patterns. Despite its obvious age, the weapon appeared perfectly maintained, its edge sharp enough to cut shadow. "This is the ritual blade used in the Guardian's ceremony," Solveig explained. "But it's more than just a ceremonial tool. The metal was forged from iron taken from a meteorite, blessed by 3 generations of vulva and quenched in water from the thermal pool. It's one of the few weapons that can actually harm the entity if it ever manifests physically." Astrid lifted the dagger, surprised by its perfect balance, despite the unconventional materials. The moment her fingers closed around the handle, she felt a jolt of recognition. This blade had been wielded by her grandmother, her great-grandmother, and women stretching back to the original compact. Their experiences flowed through the metal like echoes, offering glimpses of ceremonies performed in this very room under circumstances she could barely imagine. "Magnus hoped you would never need to use it as a weapon," Solveig continued. "But his final notes suggested that the entity has been preparing for something." Recent supernatural activity in other parts of Norway, unexplained incidents that match historical patterns from times when the binding was under stress. What kind of incidents? Livestock deaths with no apparent cause. People reporting dreams so vivid they seemed more real than waking life. Electronics failing in specific patterns. Children speaking in languages they couldn't possibly know. Solveig's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. And ravens gathering in numbers not seen for generations, as if they're preparing for something significant. As if summoned by her words, the sound of ravens calling reached them from outside. But this was not the random chatter Astrid had grown accustomed to. This was the complex, almost musical pattern she was beginning to recognize as actual communication. Through the window, she could see dozens of the black birds perched in the surrounding trees, all facing toward the longhouse. The silver arm ring on her wrist grew warm, and suddenly Astrid could understand what the ravens were saying. They spoke of movement in the deep places, of ancient bindings stretched thin, of something vast and malevolent testing the boundaries of its prison with increasing boldness. But they also spoke of the return of the vulva's blood, of power awakening after long dormancy, of hope that the Guardian's line might prove strong enough for the trials ahead. "You can hear them, can't you?" Solveig asked, watching Astrid's face carefully. "Yes," Astrid admitted, still amazed by the impossibility of it. "They're saying the entity knows I'm here. It's been watching, waiting for the transition between Guardians." "Then you understand why there's no real choice to be made," Solveig said gently. "The burden will fall to you, whether you accept it willingly or not. The only question is whether you'll have time to prepare properly." Astrid stood and walked to the hidden thermal pool, lifting the floorboards to stare down at the runestone fragment that had started this transformation. 7 days remained until the new moon, and she was beginning to understand that her uncle's death had not been the end of anything. It had been the beginning of a test that would determine not just her own fate, but the safety of everyone living in the modern world. The ritual dagger felt solid and reassuring in her hand, a tangible connection to generations of women who had faced this same terrible responsibility. But as she watched the gold coins glimmer in the thermal pool's depths, Astrid realized that the true weight of her inheritance was not the treasure or even the mystical burden. It was the knowledge that failure would unleash something upon the world that no amount of modern technology or military force could contain. "Solveig," she said quietly, "I need to learn everything Magnus knew about the Guardian's ritual, and I need to learn it quickly." The older woman nodded, her expression mixing relief with concern. "Then we begin immediately. 7 days is not long to prepare for a ceremony that will define the rest of your life, but your grandmother's blood and your warrior's training may give you advantages that previous guardians lacked." Outside, the ravens continued their complex calling, spreading word through the mountain forests that the Eriksdotter line endured, and that the ancient compact would be renewed once more. But beneath their hopeful messages, Astrid could sense something else, a darker presence stirring in response to her decision, testing the boundaries of its prison with increasing desperation as the time for her commitment approached. The real battle, she realized, had not yet begun. The next 3 days passed in intensive preparation that felt more like warrior training than mystical education. Solveig proved to be an invaluable teacher, having absorbed decades of Magnus's research and possessing practical knowledge about the Guardian's duties that no written record could capture. But it was Bjorn's arrival with an ancient map that transformed Astrid's understanding of what she was truly inheriting. The map was carved into a piece of whalebone so old it had turned nearly black with age, its surface covered with intricate markings that depicted the coastline of Norway from the Lofoten Islands to the southern fjords. But what made it extraordinary were the symbols scattered across the plies, landscape dozens of them, each marking what Bjorn explained were guardian sites similar to her own. "Your family's responsibility is part of a much larger network," he said, spreading the whalebone map across Magnus's desk. There are 47 active Guardian sites throughout Norway, each one maintaining a piece of the overall binding that keeps various supernatural threats contained. Astrid studied the map with growing amazement. The symbols were connected by lines that formed a complex geometric pattern, like a web of protective energy spanning the entire country. All of these sites are still active, as far as we know, Bjorn replied. Magnus maintained correspondence with 17 other guardians. Some families, like yours, guard individual entities. Others protect sacred groves, maintain barriers against hostile spirits, or watch over ancient battlefields where the dead do not rest easily. And if one site fails, Solveig joined them at the desk, her finger tracing the pattern of connections. The other sites can compensate temporarily, but the overall system becomes weaker. If too many fail simultaneously, or if a critical node like yours is compromised, the entire network could collapse. The implications were staggering. Astrid had been thinking of her inheritance in personal terms, a choice between freedom and family obligation. But studying the whalebone map, she began to understand that her decision would affect the spiritual safety of an entire nation. Magnus mentioned that other sites have been experiencing problems, she said, remembering the previous day's conversations. 3 guardians have died unexpectedly in the past 2 years, Bjorn confirmed grimly. Natural causes, according to official records, but the timing and circumstances raise questions. And there have been other incidents, protective rituals failing, sacred boundaries being crossed by things that should not be able to pass them, guardian families producing children with no mystical sensitivity. The entity you guard is one of the most dangerous in the network, Solveig added. Magnus believed it has been systematically weakening other sites to isolate yours, creating the conditions for a coordinated escape attempt. Astrid felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. You're saying this thing has been planning its escape for years, possibly decades, Bjorn replied. These entities exist partially outside normal time. What seems like patience to us may be active preparation from their perspective. He pulled another document from his collection, a modern topographical map of the surrounding area, marked with Magnus's careful notations. Your uncle documented several concerning developments in recent years. Wildlife behaving strangely, electronic equipment failing in specific patterns, and most worryingly, reports from hikers of finding areas where the temperature drops dramatically without any natural explanation. Cold spots, Astrid murmured, remembering similar phenomena from her historical research. Associated with supernatural manifestations. Exactly, and they're growing larger and more frequent. Solveig pointed to several marked locations on the map. Magnus was monitoring them, but he lacked the physical strength to investigate properly. The Guardian's duties require more than just maintaining the ritual. They involve active patrolling of the territory to ensure the containment remains stable. This was territory, Astrid understood. Reconnaissance, threat assessment, defensive positioning. These were skills she had honed over 3 decades of military training and historical combat. But applying them to supernatural threats would require adapting her tactical thinking in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. I need to see these sites myself, she decided. Understand the scope of what I'm dealing with before committing to the guardianship. Bjorn nodded approvingly. Magnus would have done the same thing. He believed that knowledge without direct experience was incomplete preparation. They spent the morning planning a reconnaissance route that would take them to 3 of the most concerning locations Magnus had identified. The first was a grove of ancient pines, where the temperature reportedly dropped 20 degrees below the surrounding forest. The second was a small lake, where electronic devices consistently failed within 50 meters of the shore. The third was an old stone circle that predated recorded history, where recent hikers had reported hearing voices speaking in unknown languages. As they prepared to leave, Astrid slipped the silver arm ring into her pocket and hung the iron dagger from her belt. The weapons felt natural there, bridging her identity as a warrior with her emerging role as something far more complex. The grove was their first destination, a 2-hour hike through terrain that grew increasingly difficult as they approached the marked coordinates. The forest itself seemed normal enough: mature pines, healthy understory, the usual sounds of birds and small animals. But as they drew closer to Magnus's target area, subtle changes became apparent. The bird sounds faded first, replaced by an unnatural quiet that made their footsteps seem unnaturally loud. Then came the temperature drop, gradual at first, but accelerating until their breath began to mist despite the warm afternoon. Finally, they encountered the boundary itself. It was like walking into a wall of winter. One step took them from pleasant forest warmth into air so cold it burned their lungs. But this was not natural cold. It carried with it a sense of wrongness that went beyond mere temperature, a feeling that they had stepped outside the normal world into some place where different rules applied. "This wasn't here 6 months ago," Solveig said, her voice tight with concern. Magnus's last report described a small cold spot, maybe 3 meters across. This must cover half a hectare. Astrid pulled the silver arm ring from her pocket and slipped it onto her wrist. Immediately, her enhanced senses picked up details that normal perception had missed. The cold was not random. It formed patterns, spiraling inward toward a central point where something dark and formless shifted restlessly beneath the earth. And there, at the very center of the phenomenon, she could sense a familiar presence. "It's the same entity," she breathed. "The thing in the thermal pool, part of it is here." "That's impossible," Bjorn protested. "The binding should prevent any manifestation outside the immediate area of the longhouse." But Astrid was already moving deeper into the cold zone, following instincts she was only beginning to trust. The silver arm ring grew warm against her skin, and she found herself understanding that the entity was not physically present. It was projecting its influence through cracks in reality that the weakening Guardian network could no longer fully contain. "It's testing the boundaries," she realized aloud, "learning how far it can reach, how much influence it can exert without triggering the defensive mechanisms." At the center of the cold zone, she found what she had somehow known would be there, a piece of black stone, identical to the runestone fragment she had pulled from the thermal pool. But this one was not submerged in protective water. It lay on the forest floor like a cancer, radiating malevolence that made her teeth ache. "How many of these are there?" she asked, not really expecting an answer. 12, Solveig replied quietly. Magnus found references to 12 binding stones in the original texts. If the entity is manifesting them in locations outside the main binding, then it's preparing to reconstitute itself somewhere we can't contain it. Astrid finished. The tactical implications were clear and terrifying. We need to check the other sites. Now. The lake proved equally disturbing. Electronic devices died within 50 meters of the shore, just as reported, but Astrid's enhanced senses revealed the true cause. Something vast moved beneath the water, not the entity itself, but a manifestation of its hunger, drawn to the electrical fields generated by modern technology. The third binding stone lay at the bottom of the lake, clearly visible through water that was far too clear for natural mountain conditions. The stone's circle was worst of all. There, the voices were audible, even without mystical enhancement, whispers in languages that predated human civilization, speaking words that carried weight beyond mere meaning. The third binding stone sat in the center of the ancient ring, and around it the very air seemed to twist and bend as reality struggled to accommodate something that had no business existing in the physical world. "How long has this been happening?" Astrid asked, as they finally returned to the longhouse after dark. "The manifestations started small about 2 years ago," Bjorn replied. "They've been accelerating since Magnus's death. And they'll continue to grow until the new moon," Solveig added, "unless you accept the guardianship and perform the renewal ritual." Astrid stood before the hidden thermal pool, looking down at the original binding stone that had started this entire situation. 4 days remained until the new moon, and she now understood that her choice was not simply between accepting a mystical burden or walking away. The entity was already in the process of breaking free. Her decision was whether to stand and fight or let it escape, unopposed. "Tomorrow I want to contact the other guardians," she said finally. "If this thing is preparing a coordinated escape attempt, we need to coordinate our response." "And if they can't or won't help?" Solveig asked. Astrid touched the iron dagger at her belt, feeling the weight of generations of warrior women who had faced impossible odds, with nothing but courage and determination. "Then I'll do what my family has always done. I'll hold the line until the threat is contained, or I'm no longer able to fight." Outside, the ravens began their evening chorus, but now their calls carried messages of preparation and gathering strength. Something was stirring in these ancient mountains, something that would test every lesson she had learned about duty, sacrifice, and the true meaning of warrior's honor. The following morning brought an unexpected discovery that would reshape everything Astrid thought she understood about her inheritance. While searching the rafters for additional protective items Solveig had mentioned, she discovered a wooden staff hidden in the deepest shadows beneath the roof beams, a vulva staff that had belonged to her grandmother, Helga. The moment her fingers closed around the ancient wood, the world exploded into vision. She was no longer in the longhouse attic, but standing in this very room 60 years ago, watching her grandmother perform a ritual that made the modern guardian ceremony seem simple by comparison. Helga wore robes that seemed to be cut from the night sky itself, and the silver arm ring on her wrist blazed with inner light as she spoke words that made the air itself respond to her will. But this was not a memory of the standard guardian renewal. This was something far more complex, a ceremony that involved not just maintaining the binding, but actively strengthening it through the vulva's personal power. As Astrid watched through eyes that were somehow both her own and her grandmother's, she saw Helga weave threads of pure intention around the thermal pool, creating layers of protection that went far beyond the simple containment described in Magnus's texts. The vision faded, leaving her gasping in the dusty attic, but the staff remained warm in her hands. Unlike the silver arm ring or the iron dagger, this artifact did not carry the memories of multiple users. It had been crafted specifically for Helga, attuned to her particular gifts, and it had been waiting for someone with compatible abilities to claim it. "You found it," Solveig said from below, having climbed the ladder to investigate Astrid's prolonged absence. "Magnus searched for that staff for 20 years. He was certain Helga had hidden it somewhere in the house, but he could never locate it." "It was waiting for me," Astrid replied, understanding the truth of it as she spoke. "The staff can only be found by someone with vulva blood who is ready to use it properly." Descending to the main room, she found Bjorn waiting with a collection of new documents, responses to the messages he had sent to other guardians in the network. His expression was grim as he spread the letters across Magnus's desk. "I have replies from 14 of the 17 families," he reported. "The news is not encouraging. 3 more guardians have died in the past month, all of them elderly, all of apparent natural causes, but the timing is deeply suspicious." Astrid studied the letters, noting the careful language and underlying tension in the formal responses. "What about the others? Are they experiencing similar manifestations?" 7 report increased supernatural activity in their territories, Bjorn replied. "Cold spots, electronic interference, unexplained animal deaths, and in 2 cases, direct contact with entities that should have been securely contained. But none of them are offering to help with our situation," Solveig observed, reading over his shoulder. "They can't," Astrid realized, understanding the tactical situation with a warrior's clarity. "If they leave their posts to assist us, their own bindings will weaken. This entity isn't just testing our defenses, it's forcing the entire network into isolation." She lifted the vulva staff, feeling its power respond to her touch. The wood was carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow in the changing light, and the iron-shod tip was inscribed with runes that predated the written Norwegian language. As she held it, knowledge flowed through the connection, not memories this time, but understanding of capabilities she had inherited along with the responsibility. My grandmother wasn't just a guardian, she said slowly, pieces of a larger puzzle falling into place. She was something more. A Volva with the power to actively strengthen the binding network, not just maintain her individual sight. Magnus suspected as much, Bjorn confirmed, but he lacked the mystical sensitivity to access that level of power. He was a caretaker, not a practitioner. Which is why the entity has been preparing for this transition, Solveig added. It knew that Magnus's death would eventually bring a Volva back to this site, someone with the potential to not just renew the binding, but to reinforce the entire network. Astrid felt the weight of this revelation settling on her shoulders. The choice she faced was not simply between accepting guardianship or abandoning it. It was between stepping into a role that could determine the fate of supernatural security across an entire nation, or allowing that system to collapse through her refusal. "How much time do I need to master the staff's capabilities?" she asked, ever practical in her approach to overwhelming situations. "Your grandmother trained for 20 years before attempting the full Volva rituals," Bjorn replied. "But you have advantages she lacked: warrior discipline, experience with intense preparation under pressure, and bloodline memory that may accelerate the learning process." 3 days, Astrid decided. "I have 3 days to become competent enough with these abilities to perform a ceremony that will either secure the binding for another generation or fail spectacularly." She spent the rest of that day in intensive practice, learning to channel her will through the Volva staff, while Solveig and Bjorn provided guidance based on Magnus's research and their own observations of Helga's techniques. The work was exhausting in ways that physical training had never been. Each attempt to direct mystical energy left her feeling as though she had run several kilometers while solving complex mathematical problems. But progress came faster than anyone had expected. By evening, she could consistently light candles from across the room, sense the emotional states of birds and small animals, and most importantly, perceive the network of energy that connected her sight to the broader guardian system. The Volva staff amplified her natural abilities while providing a framework for controlling power that might otherwise have been dangerously chaotic. The real test came the following morning when Astrid decided to attempt direct communication with the entity itself. "That's extremely dangerous," Solveig warned as Astrid prepared to enter the thermal pool with the Volva staff in hand. "If it can influence you during the contact, then I need to know that before I attempt the binding renewal," Astrid replied. "Better to test my defenses now, when you can pull me out if necessary, than to discover my limitations during the actual ceremony." The water was warmer than usual as she descended, carrying the staff carefully to avoid damaging its ancient wood. At the bottom of the pool, the original binding stone pulsed with malevolent energy that was noticeably stronger than it had been a week ago. But with the Volva staff in her hands, she could perceive the stone's true nature. It was not just a prison, but a communication device that allowed limited interaction with the trapped entity. Touching the staff to the stone, Astrid opened her mind to contact she knew would be dangerous but necessary. The entity's presence crashed into her consciousness like a black wave, carrying with it emotions so alien and hostile that her first instinct was to sever the connection immediately. But she forced herself to maintain contact, using techniques learned in combat to compartmentalize the psychological assault while gathering the information she needed. Images flooded her mind, not visions of the past this time, but glimpses of the entity's plans for the future. She saw cities burning with shadows that consumed light itself, saw millions of people driven to madness by dreams that rewrote reality, saw the natural world withering as something fundamentally opposed to life itself spread across the earth like a cancer. But she also saw something the entity probably had not intended to reveal: its own fears. It was terrified of the vulva staff, of the power that Helga had wielded, of the possibility that such abilities might have passed to a new generation. The manifestations outside the longhouse were not just escape attempts, they were desperate probes, testing whether the bloodline had produced another practitioner capable of reinforcing the ancient bindings. The contact lasted only seconds before Astrid pulled back, gasping as she surfaced in the thermal pool. But those seconds had provided crucial intelligence about both the entity's capabilities and its limitations. "It's afraid," she told Solveig and Bjorn, who were waiting anxiously at the pool's edge. "The manifestations, the testing, it's all motivated by fear that I might have inherited more than just guardian duties." "And have you?" Bjorn asked. Astrid climbed from the pool, the vulva staff still humming with residual energy from the contact. "I think I'm about to find out. 2 days until the new moon, and I need to design a ritual that will not just renew the binding, but strengthen it enough to contain this thing permanently." Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the mountains, and the ravens spoke of unrest in the deep places as ancient powers prepared for a confrontation that would determine the balance between order and chaos in the modern world. But for the first time since discovering her inheritance, Astrid felt the confidence that came from understanding her enemy and knowing her own capabilities. The entity might be vast and malevolent and patient beyond human comprehension, but it was also afraid. And in her experience, frightened enemies were prone to making the kinds of mistakes that determined the outcome of battles. The morning of the second-to-last day brought rain that drummed against the longhouse roof with unusual intensity, as if the sky itself sensed the approaching confrontation. Astrid was practicing advanced techniques with the vulva staff when Solveig made a discovery that changed everything they thought they understood about Magnus's death and her inheritance. While organizing her late lover's papers for permanent storage, Solveig had found a hidden compartment in the iron dagger's leather sheath, so cleverly concealed that it had taken her days to locate it. Inside was a single folded piece of paper, sealed with wax, that bore Magnus's personal mark. The letter was addressed simply to "My successor," written in his careful handwriting, but dated only 3 days before his death. "He knew," Solveig said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "Magnus knew exactly when he was going to die, and he planned for it." Astrid took the letter with hands that trembled slightly, recognizing the weight of final communications from her military experience. But nothing had prepared her for what Magnus had written. "To whoever reads this," the letter began, "know that my death was neither accident nor natural conclusion, but a strategic sacrifice made with full knowledge of its consequences. I have spent 20 years preparing for this moment, and though I regret the burden I am placing upon your shoulders, I am certain that you are the only person capable of handling what is coming. The entity we guard is not what our family has believed for 3 centuries. It is not a creation of ancient human hubris, nor is it simply a concentration of malevolent energy seeking escape. It is far older and infinitely more dangerous, a fragment of something that existed before the current universe took its present form, trapped in our reality by cosmic accident and seeking to return to its origin by unmaking the fundamental structures that separate order from chaos. I have discovered that every previous guardian, including your grandmother Helga, died at the moment of their choosing rather than from natural causes. They gave their lives to strengthen the binding when conventional renewal was no longer sufficient to contain the entity's growing power. But each sacrifice could only delay the inevitable. We have been fighting a holding action for generations while the true battle remained unfought. You, Astrid, represent something unprecedented in our lineage. Your grandmother was a vulva of exceptional power, but she lacked warrior training. Previous guardians were warriors, but they possessed only limited mystical abilities. You combine both inheritances in ways that may finally tip the balance in our favor. The entity has been manipulating events for decades to ensure that you would inherit the guardianship at this particular moment. It believes that your warrior nature will make you overconfident, that you will attempt to fight it directly rather than maintaining the careful balance that has kept it contained. It expects you to fail in spectacular fashion, creating the kind of mystical catastrophe that will shatter the binding entirely. But what the entity does not understand is that your military training has taught you something our family has never possessed: the ability to think strategically about warfare against a superior opponent. You know how to turn an enemy's expectations against them, how to use apparent weakness as a weapon, and most importantly, how to accept casualties in service of larger victory. The ritual I have outlined in the Guardian texts is not the true ceremony. It is a deception designed to make the entity believe that you are attempting the same failing strategy that has merely delayed its escape for 3 centuries. The real ritual requires something far more dangerous. You must allow the entity to partially manifest in the physical world, giving it enough hope of victory to commit its full power to the escape attempt. Then, when it is fully extended and vulnerable, you must use the vulva staff to trap it in a binding so complete that it can never again influence events in our reality. This plan requires perfect timing, absolute commitment, and the willingness to risk not just your own life, but the safety of everyone within 50 kilometers of this location. If you fail, the entity will be free to begin the process of unmaking reality itself. If you succeed, you will have ended a threat that has menaced our world since before recorded history began. I chose you for this burden because I believe you possess the unique combination of mystical power and tactical thinking necessary to attempt something so dangerous. But the choice remains yours. You can perform the traditional renewal ceremony, buying perhaps another generation of time at the cost of a lifetime spent in careful maintenance of an increasingly unstable situation. Or you can risk everything on a single decisive battle that will either solve the problem permanently or fail catastrophically. Know that whatever you choose, you have my complete confidence and the gratitude of ancestors you will never meet. The Guardian's burden has shaped our family for centuries, but it need not define the centuries to come. Your uncle, Magnus Eriksdotter. Astrid read the letter 3 times before the full implications settled into her mind. Everything she had been told about the guardianship, everything she had been preparing for, was based on incomplete information designed to conceal the true nature of both the threat and the opportunity. "Did you know?" she asked Solveig, whose face had gone pale with shock. "Nothing." Magnus never spoke of any of this. Solveig's voice carried the pain of someone discovering that a person they loved had been carrying terrible secrets alone. The traditional renewal ceremony, the binding stones, even the network of other guardians, all of it was preparation for this moment? "Not all of it," Bjorn said, studying the letter over Astrid's shoulder. "The network is real, the other guardians exist, and the traditional ceremonies do work. But they're not permanent solutions, they're holding actions, buying time for someone with the right combination of abilities to attempt the definitive resolution." Astrid walked to the hidden thermal pool, lifting the floorboards to stare down at the binding stone that pulsed with increasing agitation. The entity knew something had changed. It could sense her growing power, perhaps even her knowledge of its true nature. But if Magnus was correct, it still believed she would attempt the same strategies that had contained it for centuries, rather than something entirely new. "The vulva staff," she said, understanding flooding through her. "My grandmother never used it to its full potential because she was trying to maintain the balance, not break it. But if I'm willing to risk everything on a single gamble, you could end this permanently," Solveig finished. "Or you could destroy yourself and everyone else in these mountains." The tactical situation was clear in Astrid's mind. The entity expected a defensive action, a ceremony designed to strengthen existing containment. It was preparing to counter that strategy with accumulated power built up over decades of patient manipulation. But if instead she attempted something completely offensive, something that actively invited confrontation rather than avoiding it, she might catch it overextended and vulnerable. "There's something else," she said, studying Magnus's letter again. "He says the entity has been manipulating events to ensure I would inherit at this moment. That means it wanted me here, wanted a warrior vulva to face it." "Which suggests it believes it can defeat you," Bjorn observed, "or that it needs me to perform some specific action that will serve its purposes," Astrid countered. "Magnus is right about one thing. My military training taught me to be suspicious when an enemy makes it easy for me to do what I think I want to do." She spent the rest of the day studying Magnus's true notes, hidden in a code so subtle she would never have found them without the letter's guidance. The real ritual was indeed far more dangerous than anything described in the standard Guardian texts. It required her to temporarily weaken the binding, allowing the entity to begin manifesting physically while she prepared a vulva working that would trap it completely. The timing had to be perfect too soon, and the entity would sense the trap and retreat before committing its full power. Too late, and it would complete its manifestation and become impossible to contain. "Tomorrow night," she said as darkness fell over the mountains, "during the new moon, when the binding is naturally at its weakest, I either end this threat forever, or I hand it the victory it's been seeking for 3 centuries. And if you're wrong about your abilities," Solveig asked quietly, "if the vulva staff isn't powerful enough, or if the entity has prepared countermeasures Magnus didn't anticipate?" Astrid touched the iron dagger at her belt, thinking of the generations of women who had faced impossible odds with nothing but courage and determination. "Then I'll improvise. That's what warriors do when the battle plan encounters reality." Outside, the storm was intensifying, and she could sense supernatural tension building in the very air around the longhouse. The entity knew that the moment of decision was approaching, and it was gathering its strength for what it believed would be its final victory. But it was also revealing the full scope of its power for the first time in centuries, providing her with intelligence about capabilities that previous guardians had never observed. Tomorrow would bring either the end of an ancient threat or the beginning of a catastrophe that would reshape the world. But for the first time since inheriting this burden, Astrid felt the fierce joy that came from facing a worthy opponent with adequate preparation and absolute commitment to victory. The real war was about to begin. The day of the new moon dawned clear and cold, with a stillness in the air that spoke of nature holding its breath before a storm. Astrid woke before sunrise, her body automatically responding to the pre-battle routine that had served her for 3 decades of combat. But this morning's preparations were unlike any she had ever undertaken, part military readiness, part mystical ceremony, and part acceptance of a gamble that could determine the fate of reality itself. In the hours before dawn, she discovered the final piece of her inheritance, hidden in a chest she had overlooked during her initial exploration of the longhouse. The Guardian's armor was not the crude chainmail and helmet she had expected, but something far more sophisticated, a hauberks woven from metal threads that had been blessed by generations of vulva, reinforced with protective runes, and designed to channel mystical energy rather than simply deflect physical weapons. The armor fit her perfectly, as if it had been crafted with knowledge of her exact measurements. More importantly, it felt alive beneath her hands, responding to her touch with warmth that spoke of accumulated power and purpose. As she fastened the final buckles, memories flowed through the metal glimpses of her grandmother, wearing this same protection during ceremonies that had required her to confront supernatural threats directly. "Helga designed it, specifically for what you're attempting tonight," Solveig observed, helping her adjust the complex array of straps and buckles. Magnus found references to a final armor in her private notes, but he could never locate it. Like the vulva staff, it was waiting for someone with the right combination of abilities. Astrid replied, feeling the armor's protective enchantment settle around her like a second skin. My grandmother knew this day would come, even if she couldn't live to see it. Bjorn arrived as the sun reached its zenith, carrying news from the other Guardian sites that confirmed Astrid's worst fears. 3 more manifestations overnight, he reported grimly. The entity is drawing power from across the entire network, weakening other bindings to strengthen itself for tonight's confrontation. Which means the other Guardians are now at risk regardless of what I do, Astrid realized. If I attempt the traditional renewal and fail, the weakened network collapses anyway. Magnus's gamble is looking less risky by comparison. She spent the afternoon in final preparations that combined military planning with mystical preparation. The longhouse had to be arranged as both battlefield and ritual space, with protective circles drawn in specific patterns while ensuring clear lines of movement for the combat that was sure to come. The Volva staff required charging with accumulated energy, a process that left her feeling as though she had been struck by lightning while maintaining perfect mental focus. Most challenging was the psychological preparation for deliberately weakening the binding that had contained a cosmic-level threat for 3 centuries. Every instinct screamed against the idea of giving the entity exactly what it wanted, but Magnus's strategy depended on allowing it to commit fully to an escape attempt before springing the trap. "There's something else we need to discuss," Solveig said as evening approached and shadows began to lengthen across the mountains. Magnus's letter mentions casualties, but he wasn't specific about the risks to anyone else present during the ritual. Astrid paused in her preparation of the ceremonial components. "You and Bjorn should leave, drive to the village, get everyone at least 10 kilometers away from here. If this goes wrong, we're not leaving." Bjorn interrupted firmly. "You'll need observers to verify what happens, witnesses who can carry word to the other Guardians if necessary, and if the entity does break free, a few kilometers won't make any difference to our survival." "Besides," Solveig added with a smile that held only slight traces of fear, "Magnus spent 15 years preparing me for this possibility. I may not have mystical abilities, but I understand the theory behind what you're attempting. You'll need someone to monitor the binding strength while you focus on the vulva working." Astrid felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the Guardian's armor. Facing impossible odds was part of a warrior's training, but facing them with reliable allies made all the difference between desperate last stands and calculated tactical gambles. As darkness fell, she made her final inspection of the preparations. The thermal pool had been surrounded by protective circles, drawn in a combination of salt, iron filings, and herbs that had been blessed according to formulas dating back to the original compact. The vulva staff stood ready beside the pool, its carved surface glowing with accumulated power that made the air itself seem to hum with potential energy. The iron dagger hung at her side, its blade reflecting moonlight that shouldn't have been visible during the new moon. The silver arm ring pulsed gently against her wrist, maintaining her connection to the ravens who had spread word of tonight's confrontation throughout the mountain forests. And beneath it all, the Guardian's armor provided protection that went far beyond the physical, creating barriers against mystical influence that would allow her to maintain her own will, even during direct contact with an entity that specialized in corruption and mental domination. "The binding is already weakening," Bjorn reported, consulting instruments Magnus had used to monitor the containment's strength. "The entity knows something significant is happening." Astrid could sense it too, a growing pressure in the air around the longhouse, like the atmospheric tension that preceded violent storms. The entity was gathering its power, preparing for what it believed would be its moment of liberation. But it was also revealing capabilities that had been hidden for centuries, providing her with intelligence about its true nature that no previous Guardian had possessed. "It's not just malevolent energy," she realized, watching the binding stone pulse with increasing agitation. "It's something that exists partially outside our normal concepts of space and time. That's why conventional containment can only delay rather than solve the problem. And why your grandmother's approach might work," Solveig added. The vulva staff operates according to principles that predate current reality. It might be able to affect something that normal methods can't touch. As the hour of the new moon approached, Astrid felt the familiar pre-battle calm settling over her, the state of heightened awareness and emotional control that had carried her through every significant conflict of her adult life. But this time, the calm was deepened by mystical preparation that connected her not just to her own training, but to the accumulated wisdom and power of generations of women who had faced supernatural threats with nothing but courage and determination. "Whatever happens," she told Solveig and Bjorn, "remember that this was my choice. Magnus gave me the information I needed to make an informed decision, but the responsibility for tonight's outcome rests with me alone." "Understood," Bjorn replied, simply. "Just make sure you win," Solveig added with forced lightness. "I didn't spend 15 years learning about this burden just to watch it all end in disaster." Outside, the ravens had fallen silent, not the natural quiet of night, but the absolute stillness that preceded moments of cosmic significance. The entity was ready, having committed its full power to what it believed would be its escape attempt. The network of guardian sites across Norway was weakened, but holding, providing just enough stability to contain the backlash if her gamble failed catastrophically. Astrid lifted the vulva staff, feeling its power respond to her touch like a living thing, eager for battle. The Guardian's armor hummed with protective energy, and the iron dagger at her side carried the accumulated will of every woman who had wielded it in defense of the innocent. She had prepared for this moment with everything her warrior training and mystical heritage could provide. Now, all that remained was to discover whether 3 centuries of careful preparation and accumulated wisdom would be enough to contain a threat that predated human civilization itself. The battle for the fate of reality was about to begin. The moment of the new moon arrived with a silence so profound it seemed to press against the walls of the longhouse like something alive. Astrid stood at the edge of the thermal pool, the vulva staff in her hands and the binding stone visible through water that had begun to glow with an inner light that belonged to no earthly source. The Guardian's armor hummed against her skin, its protective enchantments responding to supernatural forces that were gathering strength with each passing second. Binding strength is down to 60%, Bjorn reported from his position at Magnus's monitoring station. The entity is drawing power from every connection it can access. Astrid nodded, stepping into the thermal pool with careful precision. The water was warmer than ever before, heated not just by geothermal vents, but by the energy of something vast and alien stirring in the depths below normal reality. As she descended toward the binding stone, she could feel the entity's attention focus on her with laser intensity. It knew that this moment was different from any guardian ceremony performed in the past 3 centuries. The moment her hand touched the binding stone, the world exploded into chaos. Visions crashed through her mind, not the controlled glimpses she had experienced during previous contacts, but a torrent of alien memories and intentions that threatened to overwhelm her human consciousness entirely. She saw the entity's true form for the first time, not a creature in any conventional sense, but a fragment of cosmic void given purpose and will, a piece of the emptiness that existed before creation began. It hungered not just for freedom, but for the chance to return reality to the pure nothingness from which it had emerged. But even as the psychic assault threatened to shatter her sanity, Astrid's warrior training held firm. She compartmentalized the alien thoughts, using meditation techniques learned during the most extreme survival training to maintain her own identity while absorbing the entity's projected memories. And gradually, she began to understand the true scope of what Magnus had asked her to attempt. The entity was far older and more powerful than any previous guardian had suspected, but it was also limited by its very nature. It could only affect reality directly through physical manifestation, and manifestation required it to concentrate its essence in ways that made it temporarily vulnerable to the right kind of mystical attack. 40% binding strength, Bjorn called out, his voice tight with controlled fear. It's happening faster than Magnus's calculations predicted. The water around Astrid began to churn as something vast stirred beneath the stone foundation of the thermal pool. Cracks appeared in the rock walls, not from physical pressure, but from the reality-warping influence of something that had no business existing in the physical universe. The binding stone itself grew hot enough to burn, but the Guardian's armor protected her from the worst of the supernatural emanations. This was the moment of greatest danger, when the entity was partially manifested, but not yet committed to full physical presence. If she attacked too soon, it would retreat back into deep containment and spend decades preparing countermeasures against her approach. If she waited too long, it would complete its manifestation and become impossible to contain through any means her heritage provided. The vulva staff began to resonate in her hands, its carved surface glowing with power that had been accumulated over generations of careful preparation. Through her connection to the artifact, she could sense the entity's growing confidence. It believed that her presence in the pool during its manifestation was exactly what it needed to break free entirely. It was preparing to use her own mystical energy as a catalyst for its escape. 20%, Bjorn reported, and now his voice carried the edge of real terror. Astrid, whatever you're planning to do. Not yet, she replied through gritted teeth, feeling the entity's influence pressing against the protective barriers of the Guardian's armor. It has to commit fully before I can trap it. Around the thermal pool, the protective circles she had drawn began to glow with their own inner light, responding to the supernatural pressure building in the enclosed space. But she could see stress fractures appearing in the mystical barriers. Her preparations were strong, but they were designed to contain the aftermath of the vulva working, not to resist a partially manifested cosmic entity that was actively testing their limits. Then, the entity made its mistake. Sensing victory within its grasp, it abandoned the careful patience that had characterized centuries of subtle manipulation and committed its full essence to the manifestation. The binding stone cracked audibly under the strain, and something that had no rightful place in physical reality began to take shape in the depths of the thermal pool. The sight of it nearly broke Astrid's concentration entirely. The entity's true form was an absence rather than a presence, a shadow cast by nothing, a void that hurt to look at directly. It rose from the depths like condensed nightmare, reaching toward her with appendages that existed in too many dimensions for human perception to process clearly. But most terrifying was the intelligence behind its alien features. This was not a mindless force of destruction, but something that understood exactly what it was doing and took conscious pleasure in the prospect of unmaking everything that had ever existed. Now, Astrid whispered, raising the vulva staff above her head as power that had been building for generations finally found its release. The vulva working erupted from the staff, like controlled lightning, following patterns that her grandmother had programmed into the artifact decades before Astrid's birth. But this was not simply the repetition of an ancient ceremony, it was the culmination of 3 centuries of preparation, refined by Magnus's research and powered by mystical abilities that combined vulva heritage with warrior discipline in ways that no previous guardian had achieved. The entity realized its danger in the instant before the trap closed around it, but realization came too late. It had committed too much of its essence to physical manifestation to retreat quickly, and the vulva working was designed specifically to exploit that moment of vulnerability. Mystical chains, forged from concentrated will and powered by generations of accumulated sacrifice, wrapped around the entity's form, binding it not just to the thermal pool, but to reality itself in ways that made escape impossible rather than merely difficult. The counterattack was immediate and devastating. the entity struck back with fury that shook the foundations of the mountain, pouring centuries of accumulated hatred into an assault on Astrid's mind and will that would have shattered any normal human consciousness instantly. But the Guardian's armor held, its protective enchantments absorbing the worst of the psychic assault, while the silver arm ring maintained her connection to the network of power that stretched across Norway's Guardian sites. Binding strength is Bjorn's report cut off as his monitoring equipment overloaded from the supernatural emanations filling the longhouse. The battle was no longer about containment versus escape. It had become a direct contest of will between a cosmic entity that predated human civilization and a woman who combined the mystical heritage of ancient vulva with the disciplined determination of a modern warrior. Reality itself seemed to bend around their conflict, as forces that belonged to different eras of creation met in desperate struggle for dominance. But Astrid had advantages the entity had not anticipated. Her warrior training had taught her to function under extreme stress, to maintain tactical thinking even when facing overwhelming odds. Her vulva heritage provided access to power that operated according to principles older than the entity's current limitations. And most importantly, she fought not for personal survival, but for the protection of everyone and everything she valued, a motivation that gave her access to strength she had never known she possessed. The vulva staff blazed with power that lit the entire longhouse, and the mystical chains binding the entity grew stronger with each second of sustained contact. But the real victory came when Astrid realized that the entity's greatest strength was also its greatest weakness. It was so ancient, so accustomed to patience and subtle manipulation, that it had no experience with direct confrontation by an opponent who was willing to risk everything on a single decisive action. The battle reached its crescendo as the entity realized that brute force would not break the vulva working that held it trapped. Its strategy shifted with terrifying intelligence, abandoning direct assault in favor of something far more insidious. It began offering Astrid everything she had ever wanted in exchange for her cooperation. Visions flooded her mind, each one more tempting than the last. She saw herself as a legendary warrior, leading armies in battles that would reshape history. She saw knowledge beyond human comprehension, secrets that would make her the most powerful vulva who had ever lived. She saw her family restored, her grandmother returned to life, her uncle Magnus standing beside her, generations of ancestors welcoming her into a paradise where duty and sacrifice were no longer necessary. But the most seductive vision was the simplest: freedom. The entity showed her walking away from this mountain, leaving behind the Guardian's burden to live the life she had always wanted. No ancient responsibilities, no mystical obligations, no need to sacrifice personal happiness for the greater good. Just the open road and endless possibilities, with the entity handling the cosmic balance in ways that required no human intervention. "Accept my partnership," the entity whispered directly into her mind, its voice carrying harmonics that resonated with her deepest desires. "Together, we can remake reality, according to principles of justice and honor. No more suffering, no more death, no more of the random cruelty that makes existence a burden rather than a gift." For a moment that lasted an eternity, Astrid wavered. The visions were so vivid, so perfectly crafted to appeal to everything she valued, that she could feel her resolve beginning to crack. The entity had studied her for decades, learning exactly what psychological pressures would be most effective against her particular combination of warrior pride and mystical heritage. But then she felt the weight of the iron dagger at her side, and through it, the presence of every woman who had wielded this blade in defense of innocent lives. Her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper through the chaos. "The most important battles are fought not against external enemies, but against the temptation to believe that there are easy solutions to complex problems." The entity was offering to solve every difficulty she had ever faced, but at the cost of surrendering her agency to something that existed outside human understanding. It was the ultimate seduction, the promise of victory without struggle, knowledge without wisdom, power without responsibility. "No," Astrid said aloud, her voice carrying absolute conviction despite the supernatural pressure attempting to bend her will. "I choose the difficult path." The entity's fury at her refusal was like standing in the heart of a hurricane composed of pure malevolence. It threw everything it had against the vulva working, testing the mystical chains with force that made the mountain itself tremble. But Astrid had committed fully to her course of action, and the Guardian's armor channeled her determination into the binding spell with efficiency that amazed even her. This was the moment Magnus had prepared her for, when the entity would make its final desperate attempt to break free by offering her the one thing it thought she could not refuse. But her uncle had understood something about warrior psychology that the ancient entity did not. A true warrior's greatest strength came not from the promise of easy victory, but from the willingness to pay whatever price was necessary to protect others. "I bind you not to this place, but to justice itself," Astrid declared, following the formula her grandmother had programmed into the vulva staff. "I bind you not to these stones, but to the will of every innocent life you would destroy. I bind you not to my bloodline, but to the choice between creation and void that defines the nature of existence itself." The words carried power that went beyond mere mystical energy. They were a statement of cosmic principle, a declaration that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of personal cost. And as she spoke them, Astrid felt the accumulated strength of every guardian who had ever lived flowing through the vulva working, adding their will to hers in a moment of connection that transcended time and death. The entity's final gambit was to reveal its true nature not as a fragment of cosmic void, but as the embodiment of the despair that came from believing that existence was ultimately meaningless. It showed her the heat death of the universe, the eventual extinction of all life, the futility of any action taken in the face of infinite time and space. "What you protect will pass away," it said, its voice now carrying the weight of absolute truth. "Everything you love will die, everything you build will crumble, everything you accomplish will be forgotten. Why struggle against the inevitable?" But Astrid had faced this question during every dark night of the soul that her military career had provided, and she had found her answer in the simple act of continuing to fight despite uncertainty about ultimate outcomes. "Because the struggle itself has meaning," she replied, pouring the final reserves of her strength into the vulva working. "Because choosing to protect life, even temporarily, is what separates existence from mere survival." The mystical chains blazed with power that illuminated every corner of the longhouse, and the entity's form began to collapse back into the binding stone. But this was not the temporary containment that had characterized previous guardian ceremonies. This was something far more permanent. The vulva staff directed forces that operated according to principles of will and intention rather than physical law, trapping the entity in bindings that would persist as long as the fundamental choice between creation and destruction continued to matter. The entity's final words carried a mix of defeat and grudging respect. "You understand the price you have paid, vulva warrior. This binding will hold, but it has cost you more than previous guardians ever sacrificed." As the supernatural pressure faded and the thermal pool returned to its normal crystalline clarity, Astrid felt the truth of the entity's statement. The vulva working had succeeded completely. The threat was contained in ways that would persist far beyond her own lifetime. But the ritual had required her to pour not just her mystical energy, but her very life force into the binding. She had perhaps hours rather than years remaining, and every breath came with the knowledge that her victory had been purchased with the ultimate sacrifice. "It's done," she said to Solveig and Bjorn, who were watching from the pool's edge with expressions of awe and growing concern. "The entity is bound permanently. The network is safe." But even as she spoke, Astrid felt a strange peace settling over her. She had lived her entire adult life as a warrior, always seeking the battle that would define her legacy. Now she had found it not in some distant campaign or tournament, but in the mountains of her childhood, fighting for principles that mattered more than personal glory. The binding stone lay quiet at the bottom of the thermal pool, its surface unmarked by the cosmic forces that had just been contained within it. But Astrid could sense the absolute security of the containment. This entity would never again threaten reality, and future generations would inherit a world where this particular darkness had been permanently banished. The price had been steep, but the victory was complete, and for a warrior trained to value duty above personal survival, that was enough. 3 months after the night that changed everything, Astrid sat in her grandmother's chair beside the longhouse fireplace, watching the first snows of winter dust the mountains beyond the windows. The prognosis had been grim. The vulva working had consumed years of her life force, leaving her with perhaps 6 months to live. But something unexpected had happened in the weeks following the ritual, something that neither Magnus's research nor the ancient texts had prepared anyone to anticipate. The permanent binding of the entity had created a feedback effect throughout the Guardian network. With the primary threat eliminated, mystical energy that had been devoted to containment for centuries was suddenly available for other purposes. And that energy, seeking a natural outlet, had begun flowing back to the woman who had made the ultimate sacrifice possible. "Your strength is returning faster than any of us expected," Solveig said, setting a cup of coffee on the small table beside the chair. "Bjorn thinks the network is actively healing you as a form of cosmic gratitude." Astrid smiled, feeling more like her old self with each passing day. The Guardian's armor now hung in the place of honor beside the fireplace, ready for ceremonial occasions but no longer needed for daily protection. The vulva staff rested in a specially crafted stand, its carved surface still glowing faintly with residual power from the binding ritual. And at her waist hung the iron dagger, no longer a weapon of last resort, but a symbol of victories won through courage and determination. "The other Guardians are adapting well to the new circumstances," she continued, consulting letters that had arrived with the morning post. "Without the constant drain of containing active threats, several families are discovering mystical abilities they never knew they possessed. The network is stronger than it's been in generations." The transformation had extended beyond the mystical realm. Word of what had happened in these mountains had spread through channels that existed outside normal communication. The ravens carried messages across vast distances, and those with even minimal supernatural sensitivity found themselves drawn to learn more about the ancient compact that protected their world from forces they could barely comprehend. Bjorn had established himself as the unofficial historian of the new era, documenting how the Guardian network was evolving from a collection of isolated families, maintaining defensive positions, into something more collaborative and proactive. His research suggested that this had always been the intended outcome, that the individual threats had been temporary challenges designed to train the network for larger responsibilities. "There's something else," Solveig said, settling into the chair across from her with the ease of someone who had found her place in this transformed world. "The village council wants to discuss establishing a formal cultural center here. They believe people should understand the history of what our families have protected." Astrid considered this development with mixed feelings. Part of her valued the privacy that had allowed Guardians to work without interference for centuries. But another part recognized that the modern world needed to understand the mystical responsibilities that previous generations had shouldered in secret. As long as the truly dangerous knowledge remains restricted, she decided, people can learn about the history and honor the sacrifices without being exposed to information that could recreate the original problems. She stood and walked to the hidden thermal pool, lifting the floorboards to check on the binding stone one final time. The artifact lay peaceful at the bottom of the crystal-clear water, no longer pulsing with contained malevolence, but glowing gently with the satisfied energy of a job completed. The gold coins scattered around it had taken on new meaning, no longer payment for an endless burden, but reward for a victory that had freed future generations from inherited obligations. "What will you do now?" Solveig asked, joining her beside the pool. "The network doesn't need active guardianship anymore, and you've proven that some inheritances can be completed rather than simply passed along." Astrid slipped the silver arm ring from her wrist, studying the intricate raven engravings that had connected her to abilities she never knew she possessed. "I think I'll stay," she said quietly, "not as a guardian maintaining an ancient burden, but as someone who understands the balance between tradition and progress." The decision felt right in ways that went beyond rational analysis. These mountains had shaped her childhood, and the longhouse had become the place where she finally understood her true purpose. But more than that, the network of reformed guardians needed someone with both mystical abilities and practical experience to help them navigate their new responsibilities. "Besides," she added with a smile that held genuine contentment, "I've spent 30 years wandering the world in search of worthy battles. It turns out the most important one was waiting for me at home." Over the following months, the longhouse became a center for learning and collaboration in ways that honored the past while embracing the future. Young people with mystical sensitivity came to study with Astrid, learning to channel inherited abilities in service of protection rather than personal power. Scholars like Bjorn researched the historical context of supernatural events, ensuring that future generations would understand both the achievements and the mistakes of their predecessors. Most importantly, the Ravens brought news from across the reformed network, stories of families discovering their true heritage, of ancient sites being restored to their original protective purposes, and of a mystical infrastructure that was evolving to meet modern challenges, while maintaining the core values that had sustained it for centuries. Astrid began keeping her own journal, recording not the lonely vigilance of a guardian, maintaining an eternal watch, but the hopeful observations of someone who had helped transform inherited burdens into chosen opportunities. The pages filled with accounts of successful collaborations, of young Volva learning to balance ancient wisdom with contemporary understanding, and of a network that had become stronger through facing its greatest challenge. "The Ravens say there are stirrings in other parts of the world," she wrote in one entry. "Places where different families have maintained different kinds of watches, protecting against threats that may not be entirely separate from what we've dealt with here. Perhaps our victory has been noticed by those who could benefit from similar solutions." As the seasons turned and her strength fully returned, Astrid found herself thinking less about the life she had left behind and more about the life she was building in this place that had always been her true home. The warrior's restlessness that had driven her for decades had been replaced by the deeper satisfaction that came from knowing her battles had meaning beyond personal achievement. The longhouse itself seemed to approve of these changes. The protective symbols carved into its walls glowed more brightly than ever, but now they radiated welcome rather than warning. The thermal pool had become a place of healing rather than containment, its waters carrying beneficial properties that drew visitors from increasing distances. And on quiet evenings, when the fire burned low and the mountain winds carried the voices of ravens sharing news across vast distances, Astrid would sit in her grandmother's chair and feel the presence of all the women who had sat here before her, not as burdens demanding endless sacrifice, but as ancestors whose courage had made possible a future where duty and happiness could coexist. The guardian's burden had been lifted not through abandonment of responsibility, but through the completion of it. And in learning to build rather than simply defend, Astrid had discovered that some inheritances were not weights to be carried, but foundations upon which entirely new possibilities could be constructed. The story that had begun with a warrior's reluctant return home had become something far more hopeful, the chronicle of how ancient wisdom and modern determination could combine to transform inherited challenges into chosen opportunities for service, growth, and the kind of meaningful connection to place and purpose that no amount of wandering could provide. In the end, the most important treasure hidden beneath the longhouse had not been gold or mystical artifacts, but the understanding that some roots were worth nurturing, some traditions worth preserving, and some battles worth fighting not for personal glory, but for the simple privilege of making the world a safer place for those who would inherit it.